Magandang umaga po mga kaibigan. Happy New Year. Isang karangalang makasama kayong muli sa isa na namang edisyon ng Tapatan sa Aristocrat. Ngayon pong umagang ito, magkakaroon lang tayo ng madaling pagsusuri sa 2014 upang makita kung ano ang patutunguhan ng 2015. And I'd like to request members of our resource persons to speak English because we have foreign correspondents with us today. And we also have our friends from the local media. We have a former cabinet secretary with us, a former chief of staff of the armed forces. We have newspaper columnists and a lot more. So, magandang umaga po. Welcome sa ating palatuntunang tapatan sa Aristocrat. We're expecting somebody from Bangko Sentral to join us today. But we have with us isang kaibigan natin, si Ginoong Chito Sta Romana, dati pong Beijing Bureau Chief ng ABC News, at inaasahan nating magbibigay ng kanyang pananaw tungkol sa ASEAN at sa South China Sea, na ayon sa Pilipinas ay West Philippine Sea. Si Professor Richard Heydarian, siya po ang isa sa pinaka-hinahunting ng mga taga-media tungkol sa kanyang mga pananaw sa napakaraming issue, maging politika, ekonomiya. Meron siyang mga 400 articles na nalathala sa iba't ibang pahayagan at ganoon din sa mga himpilan ng telebisyon at radyo. Nakasama rin natin siya. Siya po'y kararating lang mula sa ibang bansa. Narito rin po si Ginoong Avelino Zapanta, ang ama ng aviation industry sa Pilipinas. So, tatanungin natin kung anong kinabukasan ng aviation sapagkat merong ASEAN at meron pang APEC. We have Sonny Africa, the Executive Director of IBON Foundation. Sila raw po yung tinik sa lalamunan ng kahit sinong presidenteng naupo sa Malacanang sapagkat laging sinasabing hindi totoo ang sinasabi ng mga tagapagsalita. So let's start the ball rolling. Chito, how would you describe 2014? Coming from where you are, a scholar and observant of what's going on in ASEAN and in Asia.
Obviously, this question will have to deal with China and its role in the region, and as well as Philippine-China relations. I think the most important, the most significant event of 2014 was the deadline for the submission of the Chinese. The Chinese said they will not participate, but they actually published a position paper. So we are getting a clear idea of the Chinese strategy. Not officially to participate, but at the same time to participate in the legal struggle. So this is a paradox. How to influence the arbitration tribunal without officially joining in the arbitration. The second important thing to note is that the Chinese have now made it clear that their main argument is really jurisdiction. They think the arbitration tribunal has no jurisdiction. So this is the main challenge for the Philippines legal panel, to overcome this hurdle. The Chinese did not defend their 9-dash line. They did not defend at length the substantive issue. They only dealt with the procedural. Basically, the argument they're saying is that the Philippine case should be dismissed, and therefore the Philippines and China should negotiate instead of going to arbitration. This is the key issue that you should watch in 2015, how the arbitration tribunal will decide. Lastly, what is interesting is that the statement of the arbitration tribunal afterwards directed at the Philippines. The Philippines should now issue its comments, one on the Chinese paper, and China is not participating, but because it issued the paper, the Philippines will now have to meet the Chinese argument head on. And second, the Vietnamese also issued a statement of interest, and the tribunal has asked the Philippines to comment on the Vietnamese position. The Vietnamese position is a little, it's helpful to the Philippines because they say the tribunal has jurisdiction. But the Vietnamese argument is that they also claim all of the Spratlys and they have interest in it, so that their interest should be protected. So I just want to point out that as we look back at 2014, this is one significant development that will have an impact on 2015. And then the second thing I just want to point out, at the end of November 2014, the Chinese Communist Party held a foreign affairs high-level conference. And you could see an adjustment in Chinese foreign policy. The Chinese now seem to recognize that some of their assertive tactics have worked against their larger interests in Southeast Asia, and that Southeast Asian countries, including the Philippines, have viewed China as a threat to Philippine and Southeast Asian security. So the Chinese now are trying to put soft power to add that dimension and to put more emphasis on diplomacy. However, as we go through 2015, we will observe the Chinese behavior will basically continue on several tracks. One, they will continue to defend what they consider to be their core interests of sovereignty. And they will continue with their island construction. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, though, they will also try to put in more of soft power and more of the economic incentives. And that is why you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank with $50 billion capitalization, the BRICS Bank, and also the offer to ASEAN of $20 billion for projects that will involve China and ASEAN. So it will go on different levels, but they will proceed at the same time.
Chito,
Yeah.
did the Philippines play its cards well
For 2014,
for 2014?
I think we could have played it better.
So we did not play our cards well.
No, I think the Philippines has played a lot of stock on the legal struggle. However, at the end of the year is when we see, as the Chinese adjusted their tactics to more diplomacy, and we saw this in APEC, the Philippines also responded. So the question for 2015 is, can we combine our legal approach with a more diplomatic approach and take advantage of the Chinese economic strategy of offering more aid, more loans, more investment to Southeast Asian countries? And this is the test, I think, for the Philippine leadership. We say that the dispute is not the sum total.
Yes.
But in practice, we have to show that that is the case. And there will be opportunities in 2015 because we are the host of APEC, so that the high-level dialogue that started in Beijing between Xi Jinping and Pinoy, there will be more opportunities this year because we are the host and Xi Jinping has to come. So there will be another opportunity for high-level contact. And then the Chinese foreign minister, who has managed to avoid, actually has snubbed the Philippines for the past 2 years, will now have to come in. And so there will be opportunities for dialogue, high-level dialogue at the foreign minister and the presidential at the summit level. So this is the challenge on whether we can play our cards well on the diplomatic, on the legal, and the economic fronts.
But Chito, let me ask you this. Some guys at UP Diliman are of the opinion that the Philippines has no independent foreign policy.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, but I think it's too simplistic because the Americans themselves are advocating a combination of dialogue, a combination of strategic rivalry and strategic cooperation. We have to outgrow our perspective of being more Americans than the Americans. In other words, we actually can learn from their tactics of talking to China while also criticizing China. We should not only stick to a legal approach, we should enlarge the diplomatic approach, and we should enlarge the economic approach. So this, I think, is the challenge facing the Philippine government.
Richard, how do you look at 2014?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to come after Chito. We share so much in common, but while it's true that I write on a range of issues, South China Sea is definitely my specialization in recent years. My next book in September will be on the South China Sea. So definitely 2014 was a roller coaster. So January 1, China already passed a second amendment to its Hainan fisheries law, imposing more restrictions on the freedom of fishery for neighboring countries. And then within 2 months, we already saw uptick in tensions over Second Thomas Shoal. By April and May, my God, there was practically a showdown between Vietnam and China. Thousands of people escaped from Vietnam. It was the greatest diplomatic crisis between the two countries. Even ASEAN came out and indirectly criticized China. So things were looking a little bit bad for China earlier this year. And then Japan and India were coming to the picture. Shinzo Abe in Japan, the new prime minister in India. And of course, it looked good also from the perspective of the U.S. because more people were saying that China is more a threat, and now we want America to reassert its leadership as a constructive actor in the region. But as many of us observers have noted, in the last few months, China basically has launched what I would call a diplomatic blitzkrieg. So during the APEC, Xi Jinping basically took the initiative to show that China also has another phase, a more constructive phase, and China has the ability to be a source of investments and trade for everyone. Interestingly, actually, in one of my interviews with Wall Street Journal, I said, if you look at the map of Xinhua News, it does not include the Philippines as part of the Maritime Silk Road. So my impression was that maybe China is punishing us. So the Wall Street Journal guys in Beijing and Manila actually asked the Foreign Ministry of China, and they said, no, actually, it's not final yet, you know. So, I mean, if the Philippines plays cards well, maybe we'll go forward. And I think Xi Jinping was so impressive that even Obama and President Obama himself sought for greater engagement. So what we saw in the last few months was a historic climate deal between Obama and Xi Jinping, a series of confidence-building measures to ensure that there are no collisions between Chinese and American military forces on air and on the sky. On air and on the water. More than that, actually, China signed two free trade agreements with South Korea and Australia, two very important U.S. allies which boycotted the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank. So it was a Pacific charm offensive on the part of China. The little blip, I think, for China was the legal issue. The legal cycle, I think, a little bit put China in a bind. Well, the fact of the matter is, I actually just came from the U.S. A few weeks ago, and I spent time in D.C., New York, and Hawaii, and I talked to people in Pentagon, State Department, and a whole range of experts in the U.S. And you see, the funny thing is that we think that our government is just towing the line of a foreign power, and the impression is that it's America. But my impression in America was that they were concerned that some people in the Philippines, some hawkish elements, will draw the United States in a battle that they do not want to wage. And I think their concern was that to make sure that the Philippines does not misbehave and the Philippines does not dictate what is going to be the South China Sea policy of the United States. The other concern of the U.S. that I felt from U.S. scholars particularly was, as much as this is about Philippines and China territorial disputes, it is also about the credibility of international law. This is a very difficult time for international law. Why? It's a catch-22 situation. You see, China, as a member, as a signatory to the UNCLOS, under Article 298, can opt out of compulsory arbitration. So China is not opting out of UNCLOS. It's exercising its right under UNCLOS to not be subjected to compulsory arbitration. But China cannot say which issues per se cannot be subjected to compulsory arbitration. And it's up to the arbitral tribunal to determine whether it can exercise jurisdiction over this issue or not. Now, there are different scenarios. In one scenario, the arbitral tribunal, out of concern of not alienating one of its members, the China, which is a very influential country, will try to adopt a more coy position and not come up with a decisive decision. That will put their credibility into question.
Okay.
The other situation will be they could come up with an arbitration outcome that looks critical of China, but China will openly and brazenly disregard it. And that will also put the arbitral tribunal in a very difficult bind. So I think this is also as much test for international law. And the United States, although it's not a member to the UNCLOS, factually, actually, the U.S. Navy observes UNCLOS and freedom of navigation in international seas. It benefits itself and it treats it as a customary international law issues. So yes, in 2015, I think the defining issue definitely will be the legal issue. So we have 3 months to submit our an extra arguments for our memorial as the procedures dictate. Some experts I have talked to, they're optimistic that perhaps even earlier than 2016, the arbitral tribunal will not only come up with the adjudication to say that we all actually have jurisdiction and China cannot escape compulsory arbitration, but actually they can come up with a recommendation. And the recommendation is not to say that Island X belongs to Philippines and not to China. The best that the arbitration body can say is that Island X is not an island, it's just a rock, and it's not high tide rock, therefore it cannot be appropriated. And B, the 9-line doctrine of China is inconsistent with international law.
Okay.
So what we hope this will do is to push China to clarify its points, right? Because if China is not even clear about the clear coordinates of its claims, it's even very difficult to talk about joint development. How can you have joint development when you don't know exactly what is the claim of the other side and what is exactly the overlapping areas? But I think what makes me more optimistic down the road in 2015, and I think makes the Chinese also more optimistic, is that we're slowly talking about the next administration already. And I think if you look at all the contenders for the next administration, most of them are towing a more moderate line of more engagement, because we have to accept the fact that in this part of the region, China is the most preeminent power.
Okay. Would you name names as to who these characters are for 2016?
I'm not in the business of naming names. I think that's why you chose to be an academic. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, we know that at the upper echelons of the Department of Foreign Affairs, we have a number of people who I think naively believe that there is a purely legal solution to this issue. Or they can confront China and completely rely on American help. My impression is that the United States' commitment to us is conditional, it's limited, and the ultimate goal for US is to prevent a conflict that will draw them into a conflict with their most important partner.
Trading partner.
Over and over. No, I mean, over and over, President Obama and John Kerry have said that China is the most consequential bilateral relationship of the US. Not the most important ally, but the most consequential. So, given the relevance of China, obviously US, no matter how much it likes or doesn't like China, it has to accept the fact that its relationship with China, at some point, may be way more important than the relationship it has with some smarter allies.
Really? All right. So that's about China and the South China Sea. Now let's go into another critical point in our economy. That's aviation. By the way, we invited Secretary Joseph Emilio Aguinaldo Abaya to our forum today because I want him to tell us the real score of the transportation industry, which is vital in our economic growth. You know, I was in Legazpi yesterday. I saw thousands of people waiting for buses. The same picture in Naga City. But had we had the trains, we could have had, easier travel to Manila. So another anchor of this is the aviation industry. In as much as we have the father of the aviation industry, Mr. Avelino Zapanta, an author of aviation history in the Philippines from 1909 to 2012, then he can tell us what has happened to us and what will happen in the next few years. Yes, please.
Thank you, Melo. Well, 2014, I think the industry can characterize it as a year of failed expectations. Going back a few years, in 2010, all the way to 2011, we had 3 full years of complete, total, unprecedented growth in air traffic, both domestic and international. Double digit, a kind of growth rate that we've never seen before. And of course, that encouraged the airlines to set up, order more airplanes. As you know, PAL ordered close to 100, Cebu Pacific ordered some 50 or 60 aircraft, and these are currently, many of these are being delivered this year and next year. The thing, however, is in 2013, we suddenly had a zero growth. We had negative growth in the domestic and barely grew in international in terms of arrival. And of course, that caught the entire industry by surprise because we were thinking of banking on the continuing double-digit growth. And of course, we all know the answers now. The infrastructure problem is upon us, and we have not really prepared well for that. Prior to this problem of 2013 and 2014, we have brought to the government the possibility that we would encounter this problem of congested airports, particularly in our main gateway, which is Manila. And we recommended a lot of measures to be taken up by government, but those measures were not delivered. Among the measures, we asked them to open up more provincial stations so that we can distribute operation in Manila throughout the 24-hour day instead of just the 6 to 6 period. And they promised 8 airports. That's 2-3 years ago.
8 airports.
To be provided with full night landing facilities and navigational aids. None of that has been delivered. We also recommended that round about 17% of the total takeoffs and landings in Manila are taken up by the general aviation sector. These are the operators of these teeny-weeny jets, executive jets, and other small aircraft flying a few tons of fish here and there. And we said that does not contribute much to the economy because what is a flight of 2 or 3 executives as against a 747 with 400 passengers who could create a tremendous economic multiplier impact in the country. So on a one-on-one basis, we said we have to eliminate the 17% being hugged by general aviation so that we can open up more commercial flights in and out of the country. But we have been saddled with the usual problem of lack of political will. They said they'd transfer the general aviation to Sangle, but that has not really been done. The latest we hear of Sangle is that a new international airport will be built there. In the meantime, we continue to be affected by this substantial share of airport use by the general aviation.
So how would you describe Naia 2, which was once the region's prime in the early 80s?
Well, up until the first half of the 80s, we were tops as far as airport facilities are concerned. We opened up Terminal 1 and the cargo terminal at that time. We were very proud of it because the airports in the region were not comparable. But of course, that's the 80s, and we've been left behind since then. Terminal 1 is, well, actually, all the 5 terminals of Metro Manila can be effectively put to use. We have all our recommendations on how this would be done. But the primary decision that will have to be done is what the industry has been pushing, which is to do a dual airport operation. Because right now, with over 30 million passengers a year, Manila simply cannot cope up anymore, and it's increasing. If we declare Clark, for example, as the main gateway for international travel, and Manila, the main gateway for domestic travel, then very quickly you split the traffic. And there will be immediate decongestion in Metro Manila for more domestic flights. And you can open up Clark for greater international operation. Of course, the government has not made any clear-cut decision on this. They've been invoking the 2 dual airport system until Congressman Giao revealed to all of us a few days ago that there's no such policy of government.
Really?
There's no such policy. There's no executive order signed, and that's why they're all disappointed in Central Luzon, because they've been expecting that Clark would become the international gateway, and we are pushing for this because the first idea of closing Manila was, of course, very problematic. We told the secretary that you can just do that because the real origin and destination of domestic traffic is Metro Manila. This is where their children study. This is where their business partners are. This is where things are happening. And if you put the airport away from Metro Manila, then you will have a problem of millions of passengers being brought out of Manila and brought back to Manila by land transportation, which would create a lot of problem than what it would solve. So
Really?
we continue to push for that dual airport policy. No definitive statement has been done as far as that is concerned.
So from the outside looking in, how would you rate the Aquino administration?
Well, not the entire administration,
The
but
DOTC.
when it comes to DOTC, I've said it's a year of failed expectation. They promised us an air traffic management system several years ago. That's the ATM-CNS, the air traffic management system for communication, navigation, and surveillance. They have not delivered it because the former secretary sat down on it for about 2 or 3 years because he didn't understand what the project was all about.
Really?
Yeah, and of course, it's now going on, but it's
is it
yet to
Mar
be
Rojas?
completed.
Because is it Mar Rojas?
It's you who said it.
No,
it's
no, no.
not me.
No, that's for a fact. That's on the record. No?
So,
Yes.
these are the things that continue to affect the commercial aviation sector of the country. We would like the 5 terminals of Metro Manila, of Naia, to be connected to one another.
Yeah.
Because one of the big problems is when you connect from an international to a domestic flight, passengers have to go out into the public roads.
Yes.
And they become victims of traffic or unscrupulous taxi drivers.
Okay.
Whereas in other airports within the region, their terminals are linked by monorails and other...
Maglevs.
Yeah. Well, that's too much perhaps, but monorail would be sufficient to link the 5 terminals so that passengers don't have to be victimized,
Yeah.
by going out in the public roads.
Yes.
At least there is a measure that will address that particular one because of the Naia Expressway, which is now being constructed, which is giving us a lot of headache right now, but hopefully by mid-year next year, when that's...
Next year.
This year.
This year.
This year, 2015, when that's completed for the APEC, then commuting around the airport would become
Yes.
much more bearable
Okay.
than it is today.
Very good. The only monorail I know of today is the one at the University of the Philippines, which has remained a white elephant. I don't know whatever happened to it. But anyway, thank you, sir, for the insights. We'd like to acknowledge the presence of Director Zeno Ronald Abenoja. He is the Director of the Bureau Chief of the Department of Economic Research of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Welcome to Tapatan sa Aristocrat. Can you tell us the good news before we go to the bad news? What have we achieved in 2014, Director?
Thank you, Melo. Good morning to our colleagues here in Tapatan. Thank you for inviting BSP to this fora to look at what has happened in 2014, as well as possibly evaluate our performance for this year. For 2014, if you look at the growth of the economy, we have slowed down a bit. For 2012, 2013, the economy averaged about 7%. That's the fastest consecutive two-year growth rate that we've had since the 1970s. And in 2014, we slowed down a bit. We grew by about 5.8% the first 3 quarters. And this is partly due to some of the weather disturbances that that have affected the performance of agriculture. And if you look at the demand side, some of it is due to still a weak environment, although exports continue to contribute, they are not as strong as the previous years. And also to some extent, some slowdown in spending by government. But overall, we think that this is above the long-term average of 5% growth that we've had. So given the circumstances, the challenges that we face, a very volatile external environment last year, a growth rate of 6 or a little more than 6% would be quite remarkable for the Philippine economy. The target was 6.5 to 7.5 for last year. For inflation, 5 years straight, since 2009, we've been meeting our inflation target up to 2013. Last year, 2014, for the first 11 months, our inflation rate averaged about 4.3%. This is well within the target of 3 up to 5%. So we're a little above the midpoint, and we think that December inflation will continue to be low, and we will be meeting the target for 2014.
Yes. Director, yung bang savings rate natin ng mga Pilipino, has it improved over the past 5 years?
For the savings rate, if you look at the macroeconomic savings rate, it has been steady.
How steady is it? Steady? How many percent of Filipinos have deposits in banks? How many are beyond 5,000 pesos?
If you look at the savings behavior of Filipinos, for the past 5 years, the quality of the banking industry has improved. Maybe the network, if you include all the branches of small banks and rural banks, have slowed down a bit. But this is because we were closing some of the small banks. But if you look at the big banks, they've been increasing their footprint across the country, whether in terms of ATM presence, branches in different areas, even the rural areas. And that has mobilized a lot of deposits for the Philippines. Deposits, aggregate deposit levels has increased steadily over the years. And if you look at the OFW, for example,
that's where I'm going, really.
Of our stakeholders, we have a survey of the behavior of households, and this includes the behavior of OFWs. Since the early 2000s, an increasing proportion of families of OFWs have been participating in the formal sector in terms of having more deposits or having more accounts with the banking industry. And at the same time, the survey will also show that they've been they've been investing or creating more accounts, but also investing in other instruments that are being offered by the financial industry, including funds, as well as to some extent, to a lesser extent, insurance products. And this is because, again, mainly the effort of the banking industry to expand their network, and second, to educate our kababayan on how to be responsible users of the banking system.
There's no truth to the rumor that most overseas Filipinos are stockholders of malls and supermarkets because that's where they spend money, including the condominiums that these mall owners own.
To the best of our knowledge, wala naman hong ganung information.
All right. Sonny, from the other side, objectively looking at the growth mentioned by Bangko Sentral, how well have we placed ourselves in ASEAN and Asia?
To be clear, I'm not going to give the bad news. I'm going to try to give a little board. That was a Chito. I'll just try to give a bit of a fuller picture. The economy is such a big animal. You know, you can talk about the trunk, the ears, the butt, or genitals and stuff. So just to give to be clear, big picture. Without refuting the the good news that the government has been talking about the last couple of weeks in its economic year-enders in terms of still supposedly one of the highest growth rates in Asia, still supposedly upgrades in credit ratings, etc., etc. I think the big picture has to be, we have to look at overall trends. And the overall trends are actually quite disappointing because I think 2014, more than anything else, has shown the fading of a lot of hype in the Philippine economy and even in Philippine politics. The fading hype is partly shown by the slowing growth rates, but I think the more important thing to look at is the fading hype has shown that over the 4 years of the Aquino administration, it takes time to change the economy, but over the last 4 years of the Aquino administration, we really haven't seen the fundamental changes that we need to actually move forward towards ASEAN or towards a more independent, sovereign, self-standing economy polity. I say that because, for instance, in terms of the two most important sectors of the economy, manufacturing and agriculture, the most recent employment figures have shown declines in agricultural and manufacturing employment. That's the foundation of any economy. That's the foundation for any economy that will engage with ASEAN, foundation of any economy that will engage with China, very important, or the United States or Europe. If the Philippine economy in the last 4 years has not shown a strengthening agricultural sector, we can't keep on complaining every year about typhoons because they come every year. And if it's not showing any strength in terms of its manufacturing, we are not creating the fundamentals to stand up as an economy, to create the jobs for the Filipinos, to create high incomes for Filipinos. And I think that's the most important point for 2014. 2014 has shown the fading of economic and political hype. 2014 has established the Philippine economic fundamentals are not sound, and if anything, the trajectory of Philippine economic policy making is actually becoming more and more conservative. If in terms of foreign policy, we're more American than the Americans, in terms of our economic policy, we're more neoliberal than the neoliberals. As it is right now, you go to any regular university, they're reading stuff that our economic managers would do well to read. Neoliberal economic policies in terms of gushing about the free market, in terms of gushing about how unleashing capitalist forces in the Philippines will develop us through free market liberalization, globalization, all the shons that they talk about. If this is the same economic trajectory that we will take in 2015, we will pay for the sins of the past administrations and actually add on to those sins. And I think this, the current hullabaloo about the MRT, LRT fare hikes are very, very revealing. 2015, the start of 2015 is showing us how we are paying for the sins of past privatizations. We're paying for the sins of past LRT, MRT privatization. We will pay for the sins of past Manila Water privatization. The trajectory of the government right now, it's two cornerstones, public-private partnerships and CCTs. Neither of them create the fundamentals for economic growth. Neither of them create the fundamentals for a strong economy to engage in the region and to engage with our other neighbors. And we think ultimately, the long-term trajectory of the Philippine economy is very bad. Our unemployment still remains bad. There was a little bit of a blip in October, apparently some slight improvement. But put into context, the government reported slight improvement on underestimated unemployment figures. In 2005, the government changed its methodology. It's underestimating employment by about 3 percentage points, by about 1.5 to 2 million every year. If you do it on a comparative basis using the same unemployment methodology, we actually see that the Philippine unemployment right now is about 10.3, 10.4%. That is not much different from the 11% unemployment average since 2000. So I think the fundamentals are not sound. We will pay for these past sins in 2015. If anything, the 2016 elections are the worst thing that can happen for the Philippines because the tendency come election years is that, pre-election years, is that our economics and politics becomes more conservative, especially as the current administration sort of tries to hold its ground, tries to curry favor with the standard local oligarchs or foreign powers. I think that's a very, very dangerous 2015. Any hope we might have for any change in economic and political policies will not likely happen in 2015, and that actually makes things worse for 2016 and beyond.
Okay, so there you have it. Short reaction from Richard.
Yeah, I think BSP is one of the very few departments I've reserved slightly more praise than the others, including in one of my articles for Foreign Affairs magazine. I think the fact that we kept people like Amada Tatanko, I think he's one of the very few bureaucrats who was held throughout two different, very conflicting administrations. We created enough macroeconomic stability. If you look at interest rates and inflation rates, we're doing way better than our peers, like Indonesia, for instance. But I think I also agree with our friend that
Sonny.
we are doing well we're doing well at the low end kind of nature of economic growth that we
Low
have.
end.
It's a low end growth. It's very much dependent on services, on real estate, on speculative activities, etc.
Okay.
So the challenge here is how the Philippines can break out to become a truly tiger economy.
Okay.
And that's precisely where agriculture comes into the picture, which is important to poverty alleviation, and manufacturing comes in the picture, which is important to long-term expansion of your middle class. So I think on the breakout aspect, I don't think the Aquino administration has delivered much, but the Aquino administration has done quite well compared to previous administrations with the kind of economy that we have, which is very much service-oriented.
Yes.
Abnormally high rate of services contribution to our economy for a developing country. Now, to put also things into context, for a country with a per capita income of barely $3,000, with the population growth that we have, which is under 2%, growing at 6 to 7% for me should be just average.
Okay.
So I think it's quite an overstatement to say that we're growing above average, because you have to put in context that we are a very poor country, right? And with the kind of population growth we have, we need to grow at 7 to 8% to actually really help increase per capita income growth. So
Yeah.
I think that's also the other bigger picture that we have to put in consideration.
You know, I've been hearing a lot of the Philippines being a tiger economy since the time of President Ramos. Please identify yourself and the entity you come from.
May I ask 3 questions? The first one to Chito. Just now you it seems that Philippine government has expected that there will be a result of the arbitration case in early 2016. And now, based on what you said, it seems that since China issued a paper and now the tribunal regarded that paper, although it's a non-participation paper, regarded it very seriously, could that trigger or could that mean a delay in the jurisdiction case? In the result of the case? Is there any worry or is there any possibility that the result of the arbitration could go after this administration? Could even go beyond the Aquino administration? This is my first question. And I ask all, and then
I guess Chito will have to answer that.
I think basically the timetable still holds. The arbitral tribunal in the statement on December 17 said the Philippines has 3 months.
yes.
We are given till March to respond, to counter basically, or to submit our comments to answer the Chinese position paper and the comments on the Vietnamese statement of interest. After 3 months, then the tribunal, I think, is expected to ask again the Chinese, do you have further comments? We cannot rule out the possibility that the Chinese would come out with another position paper. And we have to see what happens. A lot of things have not been predicted. We did not expect that the Chinese would issue the position paper. And if you read the position paper, the Chinese basically has written a legal brief, which really reads like a counter-memorial, although they say it's not a counter-memorial. So this is the interesting thing that has developed. The Chinese are actually participating while officially saying they're not participating in the tribunal. Basically, they're trying to influence the development, the judgment, and they're hoping that on the basis of jurisdiction, the case can be dismissed. So after 3 months, around April, May, June, brings us to at the end of June or July, would be the time for open. This is where it becomes a little complicated because the Chinese are not in are not participating. So when it comes to the open deliberation, the tribunal gets to ask questions of the Philippine side. How they will deal with the Chinese side is an interesting point, or how they'll deal with the Vietnamese side. By the way, it also shows that at least there are 3 parties that are interested. That's why this is the argument, by the way, on why bilateral talks cannot work. Because the Philippines and China cannot solve the issue because Vietnam is involved. You need at least a trilateral And this is where the issue is that the countries directly involved should talk about it, but it's not only two. It's three and possibly four if you include Malaysia or if you include Brunei. So the whole issue then hinges on what happens after July. And it's hard to predict. So there is also that possibility that the tribunal, they have under their rules the prerogative to proceed according to their own schedule. The original schedule was based on Paul Reichler, the Philippine legal advisor's estimate if everything would proceed. The key to observe is that in here, there is no such thing as a default sentence. In other words, China is not participating. You cannot conclude that the Philippines will win. No. The tribunal will still consider the Chinese argument and the Vietnamese argument, although they're not officially participating. And this is what is come out now. So there is this additional complication that could lead to that possibility. But I think chances are we'll have a judgment by the first half of 2016 and most likely within the term of the Aquino administration.
Professor Richard, it's about the ASEAN integration. And this year, 2015, will come the year of finally the ASEAN integration. And can you tell us what kind of impact will this integration have to the locals here within ASEAN? And also, what impact will this ASEAN integration mean to the people or the countries outside of ASEAN? As you mentioned in your articles, this ASEAN integration does not generate a new currency like what they did in European countries. So is there anything that substantial, or is there anything that people can directly feel about this integration? Or if they cannot feel directly, what kind of impact that is significant to people in the region, and from two aspects, one for the people in the region and one for the countries outside, like, for example, for China? What does that mean for China, no matter in terms of investment or in terms of traveling or whatsoever? Thank you.
I mean, thank you for raising that question. I think I need an entire lecture to explain the nitty-gritties of this issue. But I'll try to be as quick without being too fast in how I speak. I think this actually has been a topic of a number of lectures I've given recently. First, we have to look at it from the Philippine perspective and then from the ASEAN perspective. Well, as I always said, this is not going to be a European Union, right? We're not talking about a common currency. At best, we're talking about a customs union, which is what? Streamlining the tariffs that we in place on our trade partners externally. Actually, the ASEAN has done very well in terms of streamlining tariffs that we place on our trade among ourselves. And we achieve our targets well ahead of that time. And I think that gave a strong sense of complacency to some leaders in ASEAN that by 2015 we're going to achieve it. But I think if you look at all important surveys, including surveys by the Economist Intelligence Unit, by the ISIS, not the Al-Qaeda ISIS, I'm talking about the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore.
Okay.
Practically all experts are saying that we doubt that we're effectively going to have integration as we really meant we were going to have it. Because I think if you look at the negotiating process, we have achieved 80% of agreements, but the 80% is the easy 80%. That 20% is going to get 80% of our energy and commitment, and we are not there yet. So I think there's going to be some sort of symbolic agreement that we have arrived at the consensus, but I think we're looking at maybe 5 more years, etc., before we can really move on to having an effective customs union. I think this is more or less a consensus among all reasonable people who have been surveyed. Now, who are going to benefit and who are not going to benefit? Of course, it's not a straightforward issue of country X wins and country Y loses. I think within the ASEAN, countries like Singapore and Malaysia are going to be in a very good position. For instance, if you're going to create a customs union and reduce restrictions on a banking system, for instance, the biggest bank in the Philippines, I think, is BDO. It's 1/17 of the counterpart that it has in Malaysia and Singapore. They're going to be eaten alive by their counterpart. And this is very good for Singapore and Malaysia. They're going to make a lot of money. They're going to expand. You can see more Malaysian and Singaporean bank across the ASEAN. It's also good for multinational companies who want to have segmented production process. So the low end goes to Cambodia, the high end advertising goes either to Singapore, the mid end goes to Philippines, Indonesia. So some people are going to make. Now, the other reason I think is also the rise of India. Finally, India is getting its act together. The other giant is also awakening. And if you look at India, my God, it's a huge, huge market. And if they get their politics and policy right, ASEAN is going to be very overwhelmed. Now, China's entry to the WTO it's a boon and bane for ASEAN. It's a boon in terms of imports of raw materials. Indonesia and Malaysia, even the Philippines, were benefiting a lot from exporting raw materials. But it has been a bane in terms of low-end manufacturing. A lot of low-end manufacturing have been relocated to China. So you can imagine the kind of panic that some countries in ASEAN have. What if in India comes, a way poorer country, which can offer way easier kind of labor practices, etc., although they're technically supposed to be a democracy. So I think there's also that external pressure that pushed ASEAN leaders to come together. Now, within the Philippines, who are going to benefit? I think clearly some of our people, including I think our agriculture secretary, said we are not ready for this. I think the manufacturing sector is also not ready for this. I think the Philippines will face pressure on the high-end research and development intensive Singapore, Malaysia again. I think Thailand is coming on top too. And then on the low end, oh my God, I mean now Myanmar is coming to the picture and Japanese are flocking into Myanmar like Philippines never existed. I mean, you're looking at $12 billion industrial complex near Yangon that the Japanese are developing. Why? For them, it's a much more stable country to invest in than the Philippines. So we're going to be a little bit squeezed there. Now within the Philippines, I think who are going to benefit? People are well educated, graduates of UP LaSalle Ateneo. I think it's going to be easier for them to go to Singapore because you have to have professional licenses are going to be streamlined. It's easier for us to move. It's going to be good for us. But I think for ordinary laborers in the agricultural sectors and manufacturing, it's going to be a little bit hard. Who else are going to benefit? If you look at the big conglomerates here, we don't need to name them. We already know who these guys are. In fact, in the last few months, I gave a speech in the Philippine Stock Exchange, and we look at the profit margins. Their profit margins are shrinking. I mean, these guys, their consumption is dependent on OFW remittances. We don't have a genuine middle-class consumer society. So as their profit margin thins, they have to find new markets. And as the ASEAN integration comes to the picture, it makes it easier for the Ayalas and SMs to invest in Vietnam, in Cambodia, new emerging markets. So these guys are going to do good with ASEAN economic integration, and they're very well prepared. If you look at it, I think guys in SM conglomerate have been looking at all the legal and economic and business implications of that. But if we talk to ordinary people, even many fellow academics, I think we're not really appreciating how much ASEAN integration is important and consequential to us. I think our fundamental issues, I don't even think we Filipinos feel that we're ASEAN people, you know? I mean, we are more Latino than Asian, but we cannot even speak Spanish. And I think there was...
Except for a few words.
There was actually Buenos Dias and all that kind. And there was actually a survey of like how ASEAN you can feel. Yeah. And I think the countries that felt most ASEAN are like Cambodia, Laos, and this kind of countries. And the least ones were obviously Singapore, because Singapore is like, you know, it's like an OECD country. Okay. And the Philippines, you know? So I think... Before talking about integration, you also have to address the issue of education and identity. All right. I think that's a very important thing that we also have to look at. Okay, let's just keep it there.
All right. There's a lecture already, huh?
My last question is to the gentleman from the aviation industry. Those days, because of the air ships in this region, so there are worries about these air safety issues. So, is it true that, or can I say that traveling it's more dangerous to travel in this region, especially the southeastern agents, because of there are more tropical weathers? Is it a little bit more dangerous traveling in this region than the other regions? Is that true? And also another question that, so in terms of the safety procedures or safety measures, is the low-cost airlines and the high-end or the other airlines, the safety procedures exactly the same, or there are some kind of differences?
Well, as far as aviation safety is concerned, I cannot subscribe to the idea that it's more dangerous to operate in this part of the world. In the frigid zones and temperate zones of the world, I think there are a lot more danger existing there than our tropical storms. We can actually, and based on regulations, we have to adjust our level of operation depending on the existing regulations as far as typhoon is concerned and as far as other civil disturbances are concerned. And we have the regulations for that. The CAAP, and of course, we're under the ICAO, and of course, the civil aviation authorities of other countries like the US and Europe, they're all upon us because we're using basically aircraft that were manufactured by them. So one way or the other, we come under their supervision or administration. For which reason, you realize that they could even blacklist us or well, put us in the category 2 situation, like what happened to the Philippines since 2007. So it's really not a problem as far as that aspect is concerned. The low-cost carriers operation are also governed by the same authorities. What applies to the legacy airlines also apply to the low-cost carriers. The low-cost carriers actually become different in the commercial aspects, but not in the technical aspects. Most of the technical aspects having to do with aircraft, crew, mechanics, all of those are well within the existing regulations of the different aviation authorities in the different countries. But in the commercial side of things, this is where they vary substantially. It is said that low-cost carriers are cutting their costs substantially. That's why they're called low-cost carriers. They're cutting their costs such that, well, obviously to be able to offer low fares. That's the
idea.
Yeah, that's the idea. They cut the cost in order to be able to cut the fares and be able to capture a greater portion of the market. To a great extent, that has contributed a lot in the growth of aviation, commercial aviation, even in this particular part of the world, because the Philippines, for one, has the greatest penetration rate as far as air travel is concerned. The legacy airlines have to really contend with the challenge that the low-cost carriers have put in place. Mm-hmm. And that continues on to this day. So I wouldn't worry about the safety aspects, the regulation aspect, because those are all in place. These are all regulated from the very top at the level of the ICAO, which is, of course, the organization of all countries when it comes to civil aviation. So they have the same rules and regulations that they have to be implementing.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, next question, please. From the media and from our friends, we'd like to acknowledge the presence of a good friend, Erickson, from the Beijing Press Corps. Welcome back and welcome home. Yes, please. Okay.
Good morning. My name is Ricky Sobrevinius for Mr. Santa Romana, who had indicated that perhaps the Philippine foreign policy had not done very well during 2014. One could argue that that there has been, in fact, pretty good success. Number one, the leadership of the Philippines in the ASEAN was, for instance, considered by Vietnam to be heroic, okay? And that, in fact, that kind of leadership had urged them to file their own brief with the tribunal, number one. Number two, the strong Justice Carpio position regarding the Philippine claims have gone unrebutted, on a point-by-point basis by China. Number two.
For GDP for 2015 is 7 to 8%. So it's a very, it could be a challenging target, but it's a work in progress. The performance that we've had so far the past few years is partly due to the investment in structural reforms for the past 2.5 decades, and we continue to reap the benefits from these reforms. But as was mentioned around the table, there are some challenges that we need to push forward, including broadening the drivers of growth. We need 3 legs: agriculture, services, and manufacturing. Some progress has been done in terms of broadening the manufacturers, but we need to push or carry on these efforts. Inclusiveness of growth is also an issue that will continue to be a work in progress for this administration and well into the next administration, improving unemployment as well as poverty. In terms of inflation, the target, as I've said, is lower this year, up to 4%. In the last meeting that we had, in mid-December, the target, or at least the forecast that we've had, is that about 3% for this year, and a little less than 3% for 2016.
Regarding the Philippine claims, have gone unrebutted, on a point-by-point basis by China, number 2. Number 3, China itself seems to have reversed its very aggressive position. In the last 2 years, we've had a lot of statements from the Chinese military, the Chinese leadership, that it's going to teach the Philippines a lesson, military lesson, and all that. The fact that now, with the consistent position of the Philippines regarding this issue, China seems to be backtracking and saying that they are not going to pursue such an aggressive, punitive military approach, and that it's going to do soft power. So one can argue that this is partly due to the very strong Philippine position. Worldwide opinion, China, I believe, has suffered. I cannot forget that when Premier Xi visited Merkel, it seems like Merkel was mocking China in that she gave them an 18th century French map that showed that China's 9-dash claim seems to be ridiculous because the French map only ended in Hainan. Okay, so I would say that the Philippines has not done very badly, and that it has caused, arguably, China to backtrack from its very aggressive, punitive position. Number 1. Okay, my second question, yes?
Yes, please. Go ahead with the second question.
My second question is for Mr. Abenoja. I'll be the first to say that the BSP has done a good job in managing the monetary policy of the Philippines. What worries me is that this year, in 2014, there has been a tremendous monetary expansion to the point of 20 to 30% increases in money supply. Now, there are a lot of reasons why they're doing it, which is beyond the scope of this talk. But it's long term. It's not sustainable. Milton Friedman got the Nobel Prize by saying that you cannot have too large an increase of the money supply beyond the actual real growth of the economy. Ours is 6% average, and therefore you'll be stretching it to increase the money supply to avoid inflation to up to, say, more than 12%. But we've had a sustained monetary expansion up to 30, 31%. Are you not concerned that that this will end up accelerating the inflation, perhaps in maybe 2 years. Perhaps, maybe you can comment also on whether perhaps what's preventing inflation from really accelerating is the velocity of money
Okay.
that has not been too strong.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's start with Chito. Chito, the Philippines did something good raw naman eh.
Well, I didn't say that we did everything badly.
All right, all
What
right.
I'm saying is that there is more to be done. There is room for improvement. And what I'm saying is that aside from the legal approach, there are other approaches that we could utilize to take advantage of the situation. The diplomatic approach and the economic approach. So, a combination of diplomacy, law, deterrence, and economic engagement. The different tools that we should utilize. But the point I want to make is this. The Chinese have had their own assessment. And their assessment is not only based on what the case was with the Philippines, but to a large extent based on their experience with Japan, with Korea, with Southeast Asia, and with the US pivot. What is happening, I think, is that the Chinese have realized that their foreign policy has been successful in Latin America, in Africa, you could say even in North America, Australia. The key problem, the key challenge for Chinese foreign policy is their maritime neighbors. Why is it that in the region or in the neighborhood that they are in, the people who most distrust them are their maritime neighbors, including Japan, the Philippines. And so I think we are seeing a readjustment. It does not mean that they will give up their claim. Although we have signed an agreement with the US on EDCA, although we have stood together with ASEAN, it did not stop the Chinese from proceeding with the island construction. And I expect this to continue. And it will be an irritant in Philippine-China relations, as well as in relations between China and ASEAN. So expect two tracks. The Chinese will walk on two tracks. One is they will try to improve relations with the neighborhood using soft power, diplomacy, and economic incentives. On the other hand, they will continue with what they consider to be the defense of their interests, and that's why they're proceeding with the island construction. We don't agree with it. We think it's illegal. And it could be a case that could be presented to ITLOS or the arbitration tribunal. But the Chinese strategy is basically, at bottom, is twofold. To change the facts on the ground or on the water by transforming the very features that we included in our arbitration case as submerged features, they are now turning it into islands. And under international law, it should be based on the original status. But it makes it very difficult now for the work of the arbitral judges. If they were to do an on-the-spot inspection, and this is where the challenge is for us to monitor what is happening there. What is the original state of these features, and what is the current state of these features? And that's why maritime awareness or surveillance, continuing surveillance, will be a necessary movement. So the point I'm making is that we should have no illusion that a judgment by the arbitration tribunal will solve everything. Because we're only asking for maritime entitlements. There is the deeper issue of the territorial sovereignty. Who owns the islands? And this one, you cannot do it through UNCLOS. You have to do it through international law, through the International Court of Justice, which will entail that you persuade China to bring the case. UNCLOS provided that opening, that you could proceed with arbitration even if the other side does not agree. And this is where it hinges on that beyond maritime entitlement is the deeper issue of territorial sovereignty, who owns the islands, and that is the China issue will be a long-term. It's not only an imminent issue, it's a long-term issue. So this is where I'm saying that there is room for improvement, we should have no illusion that we will solve everything in one swoop.
Yeah, let me just add, what is our barometer of success? Because the construction activities are going on. In Parasols, in the Spratly Islands, have the paramilitary patrols of China slowed down within the Spratly? I don't think so. I mean, we still need a concrete evidence that actually the Philippines' diplomatic or legal approach has slowed down China's activities on the ground. Yes, maybe diplomatically speaking, the rhetoric of China has changed, but on the ground, the PLA and the paramilitary forces, the state oceanic administration, they're doing what they've been doing. The momentum has not been slowed down at all. And I think anyone with a basic familiarization with everyone who's tracking this issue knows that nothing has really changed on the ground. The rhetoric has changed. So I think, first of all, let's be clear about that. The second thing is this.
Pakilapit lang sa microphone.
Yeah, the second thing is this. Let's compare ourselves to how Japan and Vietnam, two other countries who perhaps have an even more bitter territorial dispute with China, have been dealing with China. Japan, under Shinzo Abe, a very hardline conservative guy, actually made an effort to reach out to Xi Jinping by sending his chief of staff. Even the former prime ministers and foreign minister of Japan also met. There was a special envoy also sent from China to meet with them. There was a lot of backdoor diplomacy to open channels of communication, and that's why we saw this historic awkward shake hand between Shinzo Abe and Xi Jinping. And Shinzo Abe, coming from a very developed and powerful country, was willing to be humiliated by waiting in the hall of People's Hall in China. But why? Because he wanted to make sure that communication channels are reopened and there are no collision between China and Japan. He wanted to avoid accidental clashes, and he was willing to risk his diplomatic credibility. And Shinzo Abe was bitterly criticized at home by some of his allies and by many hardliners. That's, for me, an exercise of leadership on his part. Vietnam, my God, just April and May. I mean, they're already at each other's throats, right? But just recently, Vietnam signed its third hotline between the Defense Ministry of China and Vietnam. This President Sang of Vietnam met Xi Jinping, and they talked about, confidence-building measures. What did Aquino do? I think we overestimated how other countries are with us. And I think we have to dispense with the illusion that we have any sort of leadership within ASEAN. I don't think Philippines is seen in any way as a leader in the ASEAN. I think Indonesia and Singapore are the one who are at the forefront. And to be honest, as someone who has talked to many diplomats around the region, sometimes they're saying maybe Filipinos have to be less dramatic about things, you know. Diplomacy in Asia is about subtlety, backdoor channel diplomacy, and engagement. And this is where I think we have done not very well, especially if you compare us with Japan and Vietnam, who have as bitter, if not more bitter, territorial disputes with China. So I think that is a barometer to really assess whether the Philippines has done well in 2014. We were lucky enough that China changed a little bit of its rhetoric, but let's not overestimate whatever success or contribution we may have had.
So Trillanes has not helped in any way.
Maybe that incident didn't help also that much with backdoor diplomacy.
Okay. For the Bangko Sentral, yes, please. We've had so much money, you know, right? Yeah, we've had so much money. I don't know where it is. Anyway, yes, please.
So liquidity was growing quite rapidly, especially if you look at the numbers last year. It peaked at the recent peak was about 38% when we started last year, January 2014. But if we look at the numbers, it has gradually declined. In fact, in October last year, 2014, M3 growth rate, liquidity growth rate was about 15%, and it's now less than 10% growth rate based on the preliminary numbers for the November 2014 numbers. So liquidity has been coming down. And the high growth rate that we saw in 2013, 2014 is partly due to a lot of the inflows, the capital inflows that we have been experiencing. And what BSP has done was to do some preemptive measures. It is precisely due to the risk of price stability, risk to price stability, as well as financial stability concerns, that we did some preemptive moves first half of last year. We increased reserve requirements twice by 1 percentage points. What this does is that it siphons some of the money. It constrains, it limits the ability of banks to lend some of this money that can fuel further liquidity growth. We have increased SDA rates also in last year, early last year. And what this has done is to address partly the liquidity concerns that precisely you have cited that could spill over to price as well as asset inflation moving forward. And in the middle of last year, we've done two policy moves in terms of our overnight policy rates. We have increased them to anchor inflation expectations, to make sure that expectations remain anchored within the target. For 2015, inflation target is more challenging. Last year, the target is 3 up to 5%. This year, 2015, as well as in 2016, the target is a little bit lower. It's 2 up to 4%. The midpoint is 3%. And we think that we'll be able to be within this target over this 2-year horizon, partly because of what we are seeing right now in terms of commodity prices being more stable, particularly the oil has gone down. And this has provided some disinflationary pressures moving forward. Some of the distribution bottlenecks that we have seen in last year are slowly being addressed, including timely importation of key commodities, and partly because of some of the actions that monetary policy actions that we have done so far. So we think that the 2 up to 4% is achievable for 2015 as well as 2016.
Okay, any specific strategy to siphon the 250 million pesos from the Abu Sayyaf, which according to some is foreign direct investment in Sulu? Do you have any ideas to Wala. Okay. We have our friend Estong. Welcome home, Estong.
Ernie Reyes po, interaction.com ng TV5. Kay Chito, yung sinabi nyo kanina, sir, na EDCA did not stop the building of military build-up in the West Philippine Sea. Anong dapat natin gawin? Should we stop EDCA or we continue negotiating or what? What should be done to EDCA?
I think we have to understand two things: Chinese foreign policy and American foreign policy, so we can determine our national interests and what our foreign policy should be. The first thing I want to say is that EDCA, I don't think, will stop the Chinese from building. Ang ginagawa kasi ng China, what the Chinese are doing is reconstructing or constructing islands on the features they already occupy. They are not attacking Pag-asa, they are not attacking Palawan or features that we are occupying and then turning them into islands. They're starting with what they occupy now. Okay? It is in that sense that EDCA, I don't think, will stop the Chinese from building on what they're doing now. We don't agree with what the Chinese are doing, but what I'm saying is that the Chinese are proceeding from their foreign policy interests. Their foreign policy interests, because their point of view, it's a little complicated. We say what is ours is ours. The Chinese also say the same thing. What is ours, and they think that's theirs. We also think it's ours. The problem is, hawak nila yan. They control it, and they're now transforming it from submerged features into artificial islands. In that sense, I don't think EDCA can stop that. What EDCA can stop is the Chinese invasion of Palawan, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Because the Chinese, and this is where you have to understand the Chinese thinking, they're not interested in attacking Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. They're interested in the disputed islands. So as long as you understand that, deterrence will help the Philippines in terms of the Mutual Defense Treaty, in terms of what the U.S. considers to be our territory. You know, Treaty of Paris, the Spanish turned over certain territory that we consider now Philippines, and then it was inherited by the Philippine government. When the U.S. transferred independence, or the Philippines took over, we did not have the Spratlys claim yet. We had Scarborough, though, but not the Spratlys.
Okay.
So the U.S. position is, we do not take a position on the dispute. between you and China, between the Philippines and China. They don't, the U.S. says they don't agree with the 9-dash line, but as the question of who owns those islands, we have to solve it with the other claimants. And therefore, but the U.S. interest is peaceful, through a peaceful settlement. So the only basis where we can claim, where we can cite that the U.S. should help us is if the Chinese, for example, were to attack Philippine government forces. For example, in Ayungin, if the Chinese were to take over the Sierra Madre or drag it out. And that's why the Chinese, they are very careful not to do something like that. If you notice in the Scarborough standoff, they did not fire a single shot.
But they fire water cannons.
Yes, but is water cannon, can you invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty with the U.S. on the basis of the water cannon? You have to answer that question. That is why it is calibrated confrontation. They don't want to face a stronger force, the U.S., but they're willing to face us. If we start shooting, they will certainly attack back. So the question for us is not to fire the first shot. We should be on a defensive mode, protect what we have, and don't give up what we have, but do not have the illusion that the Americans will attack the Chinese islands. They will not. Why would they? So this is what I mean. As an ally of the U.S., we have to understand how the Americans are thinking, and as a rival of China or as having a dispute with China, we have to understand the Chinese mind. Only then can we attain victory. If we pay attention to knowing how the other side thinks and we pay attention to our tactics. So the opening move is very important. How you start. And it's best that we don't fire the first shot. You have to show that you are under attack as opposed to initiating.
When we were attacked by the Chinese, then the U.S. will
do what?
response.
There is no automatic response clause in the Mutual Defense Treaty. We have to invoke it, and then the U.S., if you read the treaty, can act in accordance with its constitutional processes. In other words, it goes through the U.S. Congress, the U.S. President has to declare. There's a provision, though, under the U.S. Constitution or the U.S. legal system that the U.S. President can invoke the War Powers Act, and it's given like 30 to 60 days to deploy troops. But will the U.S. do it on our behalf? Are they willing to put American lives on the line on behalf of Filipinos? Remember Bataan. That is the lesson of history. And so the point I'm making is that there is a need to follow what is in our Constitution, to have an independent foreign policy based on our consideration of our own national interests and not to have any illusions about the great powers. They will only do it if it's in accordance with their own interests. And what is the U.S. interest? Freedom of navigation. If the Chinese were to blockade the South China Sea, then you will see the U.S. reacting. But if it is a question of the islands, it depends on how the conflict unfolds. If we start it, the U.S. will probably try to control you, and which I believe is what the U.S. is doing now. They're trying to advise the Philippines, don't start anything expecting to drag us into the war. What the U.S. is trying to do is to build our capability to defend ourselves. It's like, remember the Nixon doctrine in Vietnam? You defend your own selves. We won't defend you. But we will give you the weapons to defend yourselves.
Yung sinabi nyo rin kanina na pagka nababago na yung mga features dun sa island, mahirapan tayo sa claim sa international arbitration arena. What shall we do? Are we going to stop them putting up military strips or whatever on the islands?
it actually poses a challenge. What the Chinese are doing right now in the South China Sea, from my point of view, based on the study of Chinese foreign policy, is a pushback. We're claiming it, we're saying it's submerged features, and we named it in our arbitrations tribunal case. What they're doing is exactly yung submerged feature na pinangalanan natin, the ones that we named, that's the one they're turning into artificial islands. It's their way of showing, even if you win, come and get us. So the point is, though, we're still seeing their plan unfold. We have seen on the internet what we think is their plan. Airfield, port facilities. Pero it's also coming out in the media reports that they're experimenting. Can you really turn it into a big island with an airfield? They're doing a technical test right now. That's what they're doing. But I don't exclude the possibility they will set up an airfield there. Kasi meron ng Philippines sa Pag-asa, meron ng Taiwan has one in Ituaba, the Vietnamese have their own, only the Chinese don't have their airfield in the Spratlys, but they have one in the Paracels.
Paracel Island.
So it's a complicated thing that has strategic implication. Because the overall context here is the escalating rivalry between China and the U.S. The U.S. is still the dominant power in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific. What is happening is that before, U.S. power was unchallenged. But what we're seeing is the rise of Chinese power, which is now challenging the dominance of the U.S. So instead of just having one power, you're seeing a rising power.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Sige, dalawang ladies to. Yun. Sige. Parang ladies eh. Sige. Lucy.
Yes. Hi, I'm Lucy Arguelles, former opinion editor of Manila Bulletin and former editor-in-chief of the Opinion. Okay. My question really has been answered by Chito, so I will direct my question to Mr. Zapanta. But I'd like to thank the young professor from Ateneo for giving me a word for the day and a term for the day, my term for the day, of diplomatic blitzkrieg and complacency or complacent, okay? My question or hypothetical question for Mr. Zapanta, because as we speak right now, transport groups are trooping to the Supreme Court to protest the MRT rates, which is for the masa actually. When I was a young girl, my father, my parents, a very young girl, wag na itanong ko anong age ko ngayon, I rode the first class coach to Naga for the
Peña Francia.
Yeah, for the Peña Francia. But I never took the Damortis, and I'm really disappointed that we don't have that anymore. In Batangas City, I'm Batangueña, we have an RR station there. Pero wala, patay na for a very long time. Now, my question is, which is really a hypothetical question for Mr. Zapanta, is that if you were DOTC secretary or DOTC consultant or appointed as a transport czar, what will be your moves for 2015? If you were, really.
Delikado to.
Well,
There is a constitutional
actually,
provision.
we have submitted our advocacy. And the advocacy is to immediately decongest Metro Manila, Naia.
Yes.
Let's split the operation. Let's make Clark the main gateway for international and Manila the main gateway for domestic. In that case, at least 1/3 of the existing traffic of Manila, you immediately throw to Clark, and you open up and decongest Manila in order to allow for domestic transportation to grow.
Yes.
And of course, international transport will continue to grow in Clark because while it has not been pronounced as the international gateway, government, as we know, are slowly developing Clark. We have Terminal 2 that's been completed. This year, the Central Bank is supposed to finally approve the low-cost carrier terminal, which, according to Abaya, will be done in phases instead of a one go. But that's better than nothing. At least it will be started this year. So international will continue to thrive in Clark. And I think the economic environment of Clark will be supportive as well of that. In Manila, which is the more important as far as my view is concerned, it's important that the domestic operation will continue to thrive. It will be hampered if international operation will not be removed from Manila because both domestic and international in Manila simply will not do. Today, airlines cannot add more flights. What they are doing is that they are recycling flights. They are canceling flights that are not performing very well. They're trying to replace it with flights that they deem to be that will be successful. They are now trying to use bigger aircraft on the main trunks. That's why you see the A330s flying to Cebu and Davao, because that helps provide more capacity. So you can see the problem of domestic travel in Manila. And it's important that the domestic airport will be close to Manila because, as I've said, the origin destination, the OND of air travel in the domestic is between the provinces and Manila and not anywhere else. So the question of what will happen to the connecting passengers for international travelers landing in Clark who would want to go to domestic destinations. Well, there are measures that are addressing that. One of the measure is the Packet Open Sky, where we are seeing now airlines, foreign airlines and local airlines operating in more of our international airports. And that's the idea. Tourists would like to fly from the real origin like Seoul all the way to Boracay. They wouldn't want to fly to Manila or Cebu and connect there. They hate connections. They want to go from the real origin to true destinations. So the Packet Open Sky is helping that slowly. But if only government is in a position to make Bacolod, Iloilo, Puerto Princesa, Cagayan de Oro truly international gateways by providing not only the infrastructure but also full CIQ services, then we will see the decongestion not only of Manila but also of Clark and of Cebu, which are currently the international gateways of the country. We have to open up more of this. This is also because we are now getting into the ASEAN single aviation market, which is this year already. And the policy aspects of the ASAM or the ASEAN single aviation market has been put in place. And all 10 countries have accepted it. We are now free to fly anywhere within the 10 member countries and enjoy third, fourth, and fifth traffic rights. Fifth traffic rights is the ability to carry on a flight originating from your country. You can fly to Singapore and pick up traffic for Bangkok. And from Bangkok to Kuala Lumpur, all over. So it is just a matter of our entrepreneurs, particularly in the airline business, to take advantage of this. We are the last holdout in signing the so-called Protocol 5 and 6 that allows for unregulated, full operation of capital cities, capital to capital. We were holding out because we said Manila is congested, we cannot allow that. But we have opened up the rest of the country for the ASAM. And all the other countries have also opened up. Jakarta was next to us was the last hold, but they also signed up Protocol 5 and 6. That means that we can travel anywhere within ASEAN. ASEAN as well can now begin to negotiate with different countries like China. Actually, there's already an ASEAN-China agreement, except that things are very fluid because of the maritime problem with China. But the same thing can happen with India, the same thing can happen with Japan, wherein ASEAN, as an economic bloc, will be negotiating with all of these countries around us.
Just one question. Do you think with your formula or with your being a consultant or hypothetically as a transport czar, do you think Pinoy will listen?
Well, I guess it's too late for Pinoy. His term is about to end. My only wish for this administration is to be able to really launch what they should have launched, what they should have started a long time ago. And hopefully, if another pro-Pinoy boy will take over, hopefully the project will go through. Remember, they are projecting projects way beyond Pinoy's term. Like the Sangley thing is supposed to be a long-term project to be completed 2025 yet. So I just hope that they'd be able to launch all of those major projects.
Where China comes into the picture, when we talk about big infrastructure, you need technology, you need affordable technology, and you need capital. And if there's one country in the whole world that has a lot of cash and technological expertise on its hand, it's obviously China. And I think this is where engagement with China is important, because that will have a spillover effect over our large infrastructure projects at home. We can have good plans, but we need capital, we need money. Our friends from the US and Japan are not in a position to provide that. The ADB and World Bank are short of that. And that is why we need to reach out to countries like China, who can provide very affordable capital and technology on big infrastructure projects.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Yan from Phoenix TV Hong Kong. My question would be for Sir Chito and Richard. This is in relation to the question on South China Sea. So now that we know what the U.S. and China are thinking, what do you think are the Vietnamese thinking? I mean, how likely is it for them to file their own arbitration case or to join that of the Philippines? Because 1 year is still a long time, like anything could happen.
So how does Vietnam...
How will,
Right.
yeah.
How do you look at Vietnam today?
I actually attended, 3 conferences in Vietnam over the past half a year, because I've been trying to figure out what the Vietnamese are thinking. And I must say the Vietnamese have pulled a lot of surprises the past 6 months. First, after the Chinese put the giant oil rig there, they organized a special conference, and a UP law professor was with me. They were actually asking for advice from international experts on what to do. And at that point, it seemed like they were ready to either join us or file a separate case, a more focused case using UNCLOS against China for putting the oil rig on the EEZ, or on what Vietnam considers its EEZ. And then it didn't happen. Instead, the Vietnamese leadership decided on bilateral talks with China, improving bilateral relations. They sent a Politburo member to China, and the Chinese responded. So, and then the third surprise was then they suddenly filed their statement of interest. What is happening, I think, in Vietnam is really a reflection, one, of a strong party-to-party relations with China, because Vietnam is still ruled by a communist party. On the other hand, the Vietnamese have a very strong tradition of independence, because they were occupied by the Chinese for 1,000 years. The Vietnamese, if you go to the Vietnamese museum, they openly speak about this, the period of Chinese domination. They were not only a tributary state, which, by the way, the Sultan of Sulu used to be a tributary state of China, but the Vietnamese were an outright part of Chinese territory for under the several dynasties in the past, Yuan dynasty and so on. But but the Vietnamese managed to fight for their independence. So these two trends are fighting or are in the process of struggling. But the dominant situation right now in Vietnam, the Vietnamese have decided on a very clever strategy. On the question of paracels, bilateral approach with China. On the question of the Spratlys, multilateral approach through ASEAN and international legal organization. And so you see, and this is what I mean, that we should learn from the Vietnamese, walking on different channels, you know, a legal approach, a diplomatic approach, a bilateral approach, a multilateral approach, an economic approach. You use all the tools available to advance your national interest. So my own personal view right now is that the Vietnamese have provided a counter-example. The Vietnamese are watching us in terms of what we can get from the legal struggle, but the Vietnamese also has provided the case, let's see what they can get from negotiations with China. Who gets more to their interests? And that will prove to be the wiser approach. So they're watching us and we're watching them, but at the same time, you could actually use some of their tactics. If you notice in ASEAN, a dominant Chinese objective is to prevent any other ASEAN country from following the Philippine example. So they've tried to isolate us. That is why the Chinese foreign minister has visited all the ASEAN capitals except the Philippines. That is why the Chinese president has visited some key ASEAN countries together with the premier, except the Philippines. But now that we are hosting ASEAN, they are forced to come to the Philippines, to APEC, sorry. They are forced to come to the Philippines and to have high-level talks with us. The question is, can we turn this to our advantage and to a bilateral advantage on both sides? So this is the challenge. For the Vietnamese, I think they will watch closely. They will, for now, if you notice the latest reports, the Chinese Politburo sent a member of the Politburo to the Vietnamese over Christmas, the New Year holidays. And it is now coming out that the Chinese leadership told the Vietnamese, don't follow the Philippines. You made a mistake in submitting the statement of interest. The arbitration tribunal has no jurisdiction. You are wrong. But the Vietnamese maintain their position. So the differences are there. The question is, can the Vietnamese achieve some of their goal? In the case of Vietnam, unlike the Philippines, China is the leading investor in Vietnam. China is the leading export market for Vietnam, and China is also the leading source of tourists for Vietnam. That is why the Vietnamese could not follow the Philippine example. Because if the Chinese were to cut off all economic ties, one Vietnamese scholar said, it would cost us 1 million jobs. And that means domestic instability in Vietnam. So the key for the Vietnamese is survival of the regime, of their domestic regime. And they're deciding on the basis of what's to their best interest, and what we're seeing is their decision on what's to their best interest,
Okay.
which is bilateral relations with China, but joining us in a statement of interest on the case.
We have to acknowledge the fact that Vietnam's foreign policy is a negotiated outcome of some sort of factional politics going on there. So on one hand, you have the original Northern Vietnamese leadership, President Tsang, the leader of the Communist Party. These guys want to maintain stable relations with China almost at any cost. But at the same time, they know that if they look weak towards China, they're going to have domestic political backlash, and we saw that. 1,000 Chinese had to escape from China. Many were injured. Factories were burned, including everyone who was looking like Chinese in Vietnam. So that's a problem. Then you have the other faction, which is led by the people who come from southern Vietnam. They're a little bit more pro-American. They're very concerned with China. They want to reach out to China. So that is why Vietnam is throwing different proposals outside. And that's why, who said that? That's always that question. Is it the premier who said that, or is it the president who said that? That's always the question I ask. So the question is, who is in charge? I think, by and large, the original, Politburo, the president and the pro-China faction is still in charge. But even the pro-China faction is hedging its bets by reaching out to the United States and by trying to indirectly support the Philippines. When it comes to China, I think we also should not have an illusion. I think a good friend, Professor Charles Thayer of Australia, said something very interesting. Basically, Vietnam is piggy banking on our legal approach. Like they're saying, go on, Philippines, do it. File the case, let's see how far you go, and then let's watch what happens. If things look good, we will join you, but we'll not join you full force. So it's a very calibrated support, and they're smart. So unfortunately, we're like the guinea pigs in this picture. We're pushing everything, and everyone is watching what China will do to us. Let's be very honest about that. And the third thing is Vietnamese are very realistic. They're right. Philippines has a mutual defense treaty. If things escalate out of control, it is true that China has nothing in its mind to, let's say, invade the Philippines. It's ridiculous. But there's always a possibility for escalation of cyber attacks against the Philippines and etc. And that's where we can, mutual defense treaty could be a little bit effective. The Vietnamese have no ally whatsoever, no treaty alliances. By the way, their top arms source of arms is Russia. And by the way, thanks to Ukraine and all, Putin is now closer to China than ever. So they cannot even rely on Russia to support them. So the Vietnamese are very realistic. So let's not expect Vietnam to follow our course. And let's be realistic, the Vietnamese are watching us and seeing what the Chinese do to us, and based on that, they make their next move.
All right.
Thank
Well
you.
said. Okay. Let me ask Lingoy and Tess before we wind up.
So this is addressed to Mr. Zapanta mainly. Okay. Starting with our capital cities airport, the the Ninoy Aquino International Airport. My question is, I'll narrate all my questions first. No? First, is the Naia capable of having a second runway built? Number one. Number two, for a layman, one way of comparing airports, let's say, would be how many tubes there are in Naia 1, Naia 2, and Naia 3 as compared to Clark. And that's one. Then the third question is, why is it that there is still a live proposal to build an airport in Sangli, despite the fact that there is one in Clark, and there's a lot of space, in real estate space in Clark, and the space in Sangli is very limited. And finally, about 2 years ago, there was a rumor that there was a proposal to build an airport in Talim Island. So could
Laguna de Bay.
Laguna de Bay. So could you enlighten us on these 4 points? So the first is, can Naia accommodate a second runway? Number 2, what is the comparison between the number of tubes? Or if you have a better comparison, like covered space for passengers, for cargo, etc. Comparison between Naia and Clark. And also, how long does it take to build terminal facilities as opposed to building a runway, both the airplane and the people side of an airport. And finally, the Laguna de Bay proposal.
Project. Okay.
Thank you.
Actually, third runway, because there are 2 runways in Manila already, the domestic and the international, although they bisect one another. That third runway, from the very beginning, and I wrote about that, that would not be possible. And indeed, they gave it up, because it's not possible. It would become possible only if they'll drive away all of the village residents of Multinational and Merville, because the space for a third runway has been eaten up by these subdivisions. So what's left that they contemplated on was very small. And it's not good enough to build a third runway. The additional flights that they will not be commensurate to the time and effort that would be expended. So they have given up on the third runway. The terminals, Terminal 1 has 16. Terminal 2 has, I think, the same number. Terminal 3 has 20. Aside from the remote parking areas, of which there are, I think, about 10 to 15 remote parking areas. Now, compared to that, Clark is nothing. There are actually only 2, and I think the new terminal has another 2, 4. However, the low-cost operation is the one targeted for Clark. And low-cost operations don't need gates. As you know, they don't want to use air bridges. They would rather use the 2 doors of the aircraft for a quick turnaround of flights, because their lifeline is based on optimal utilization of the aircraft, which can be achieved by quick turnarounds using 2 doors instead of 1. So that's very basic as far as low-cost carriers are concerned. However, international flights is much less in terms of magnitude compared to domestic. So Clark is just right, because the coming development of Clark, including the Airtropolis dream for Clark, will provide a terminal facility that will be good for some 80 million passengers a year, which would make Clark an aerotropolis already at that point in time. But that's at least in the blueprint already. Now the Talim Island, we oppose that because Laguna de Bay is the source of our potable water in the future, and putting up an airport right in the middle of the lake, a living lake at that, will obviously kill the lake and all the maritime life there. So we don't go for such a project. I think the Sangli project suddenly came up because that's the constituent of Abaya. That's his district.
So that's the reason.
Yeah, that's his district.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that explains.
Well, we were originally talking about shifting general aviation from Naia to Sangli. And the government said, yes, we'll do it, except that they didn't do it because they don't have the political will of driving away the Ayalas and all of those business jets in Naia. So they just can't do it, no? So that's the problem. So instead of making it a general aviation area airport, it became a big project, which is a long-term project. I don't mind them toying with that idea because that's a long-term project anyway. If they have the wherewithal to push it, then good for them, good for the country. But the problem is right here and now. It's immediate.
Okay.
And the response should be immediate as well.
Thank you.
For anyone who would like to answer, but specifically for Richard and Chito, given the fact that you've stated already your positions vis-a-vis the foreign policy from the point of view of China and the ASEAN perspective, do you think the Pinoy administration is doing well, or how would you rate the Pinoy administration vis-a-vis its foreign policy with respect to the situation that you have provided this morning? What's your take on the particular foreign policy?
Okay. I think you have to understand where Pinoy stood, where he's coming from. I think in the beginning, he tried hard to reach out to China. And this is shown in 2 examples. One was the Nobel Prize. The Philippines actually did not attend, and this was an issue of human rights and democracy. The reason being that Pinoy was trying to reach out to the Chinese, but his goal was basically to save the lives of the Filipinos and Filipinas who are serving in the Chinese death row because of being drug mules. And the second was, remember the Taiwanese syndicate? The members were deported not to Taiwan, but to China. because they were victimizing Chinese victims, among others. But that caused a controversy with Taiwan. But again, the overall motive was to try and gain the goodwill of the Chinese to save Filipino lives. It's turned really on the execution of the Filipino drug mules. We got a 1-month clemency, but then there was disappointment that we only got 1-month clemency, and there was no lifting of the death sentence and turning it into a life term instead. But the key, if you ask me, are two things. March 9, 2011, Reed Bank or Recto Bank, because it involved the issue of oil and natural gas. And the Chinese harassed, 2 Chinese ships prevented a ship that was leased by Philex from continuing with the survey. So that was the first thing that I think turned the precedent against China. But the biggest thing was Scarborough. The ending, the way it ended, left a very bad taste in the mouth of the Filipino leadership. One, because Filipino fishermen could no longer fish in Scarborough. And second, the proposal was, let's go back to the status quo ante, the situation before April, before the standoff. Instead, the Chinese remained in Scarborough, and we could not afford a standoff with the Chinese. We did not have the capability, so that's when we resorted to legal means. So from that perspective, I think the President will get credit for trying to resort to rule of law, to recover Scarborough and to clarify the maritime entitlement. Where I think there is room for a lot of improvement is this. You see, the Philippines, we cannot move out of Asia. We cannot people can immigrate. OFWs can go elsewhere, but Filipinos will have to stay where they are. And we cannot move to the Caribbean or elsewhere. We have to live where we are, and because of this, we have to look at the relations of the Philippines with the major powers. We have good relations with the US, we have excellent relations with Japan, but we have bad relations with China. So there is an imbalance in our foreign policy. The point I'm making is that we should have good, normal, if not good relations with all major powers in the region, be it India, China, US, Japan, Indonesia, and ASEAN. And secondly, we should stand together with ASEAN. ASEAN right now on the issue of the territorial and maritime disputes is split. All the land, the areas on the continent that are members of ASEAN, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, even Vietnam, they now are trying to improve relations with China. If you look at the island, the maritime neighbors, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. Brunei has decided to go for quiet diplomacy. Malaysia has decided to go for quiet diplomacy with China. Even Indonesia also. We are the ones who have taken a very strong, hard approach. So the point I'm making is, you can stand for your legal rights, but at the same time, you have to resort to law, not only to law, but also to diplomacy and engagement. So this is where I think there is room for improvement.
Okay. Richard?
Yeah, I'll be as quick as possible. I think, first of all, okay, I'm totally against the previous administration, Gloria Macapagal administration, but let's give her credit for freezing the conflict. So under Gloria Macapagal administration, we did not have any major escalation. So what were the achievements of the Aquino administration? We lost the Scarborough Shoal. The second Thomas Shoal is technically disputed right now. China is inches away from imposing an ADIZ. So I think things are not looking very good in terms of really constraining China's push into the South China Sea on that front. More than that, if you look at our trade and investment relations with China, that has been pretty frozen also. So opportunity costs have been definitely there because of our confrontational approach. Nonetheless, I think Chito was right that in 2011 there are a lot of efforts. I would say in 2013 also there was a lot of efforts. Remember, he wanted to go to China, to Nanking, to meet Li Keqiang. It did not push through. I think the Chinese were making a mistake. They were asking us to drop our case. That was too much to ask. In November, in front of FOCAP, he basically contradicted his defense and foreign secretaries by saying, no, the Chinese are not putting concrete blocks there. You know, and this was the time I was getting very excited and I was saying, yo, our president has actually a learning curve. Do not give up on him. And then boom, by February, in an interview with New York Times, he likens China to Nazi Germany, basically, and boom. Like, so this is my problem with him. You know, like he has moments of brilliance and then boom, I don't know what happens.
Which is more often?
I think the problem with our foreign policy under the current administration is that, first of all, it's not incubated enough. There's too much domestic politics and sensationalization.
And everybody talks.
And everybody wants to chip in, and that's not, including us, of course, but maybe we know better than them. And the second thing, I think, is, that's one. Another thing is, it's too reactive. So like, for instance, I mean, ahead of the APEC summit, Aquino I think he was not really reading the political map. The Japanese were actually reaching out already, and then the Vietnamese were reaching out. And then when Aquino saw that he was being isolated as the only Asian leader who was trying to, like, you know, have a tough stance, what did he do? He had 10-minute speech while on gardening in somewhere. That's not diplomacy for me. That's not diplomacy.
Yeah.
So this is my problem. He should better read the geopolitical map. I think he should get better geopolitical advisor on that front. So I don't think he's a terrible guy. I think he had great intentions. I don't think there's any question of treachery. The questions that were thrown at the previous administration, for instance, the joint development, joint seismic undertaking that we had from 2005 to 8. I think part of the joint development, I mean, these were the parts that China did not even ask for, and then the GMA allowed for joint development there. I think that was a little bit controversial. No, so we have no issue of treachery with Aquino administration. The issue is proactiveness and creative diplomacy. And you cannot have creative diplomacy if you cannot read the geopolitical map properly.
Okay.
All right, so I think this is basically, but he still has 2015 and things can change. We are hosting APEC. He can pull off some magic. So I hope there'll be a last spark of brilliance. And we definitely need that before he steps down.
Very well. You know, I asked the president last FOCAP, last October, about the status of the Philippines-China relations. And his answer was, it's roughly the same. And then I asked if he would have bilaterals. He said, none has been arranged. And yet, during the tree planting, they talked. We have another question? Sige na. Follow up. Sige, before we have the final statements.
Last question.
The two. One follow-up and one new. Okay. My follow-up to Mr. Zapanta is, I suppose that he studied not only the airports, but the access to the airports. So could he update us on what happened to the, what happened to the North Rail and other plans that would make Clark more accessible? And what are his suggestions to have faster, faster projects at lower cost to support the transfer of the international side to Clark? So that's my follow-up question.
Actually, there are existing measures now, and hopefully they will progress for the next coming years. One is, of course, the Naia Expressway. The Naia Expressway will connect all the terminals as well as the entertainment city and the resort world city and Skyway. So that will be a good a measure to solve the traffic problem around Manila itself.
Brave, but he conquers that fear. And take it from Nelson Mandela. Thank you. Have a nice day.